Good morning, everyone. I'm Erin Venny-Valrath. I'm the New York State DEC Lake Champlain Coordinator, and I'm here to moderate the harmful algal bloom session. So first off, we have RJ Turcotte. He is the Nantucket Land Council's ecologist and Nantucket waterkeeper. He runs the organization's education and research programs and works with the executive director on advocacy issues. RJ earned a bachelor's degree in marine biology at the University of Rhode Island, and his experience includes water quality monitoring and habitat restoration projects in southern New England. With that, I will pass it off to you, RJ.
Thank you. So thank you for the awesome introduction, Erin. This is a project that the Nantucket Land Council did in cooperation or corroboration with IBM Research and Greenwater Science Lab down in Florida. The two main researchers from IBM we worked with were Vince Moriarty and Mike Kelly, and myself and Emily Molden and Jim Sutherland from the Land Council worked together on this project and have been for the last couple of years, but 2019 was the first year, and it turned out to be the first year that we got significant results. So we put a note in that got published in the June 2021 issue of Lake and Reservoir Management, volume 37, issue 2, note 113, which is the detection of airborne antitoxin A on a glass fiber filter during a harmful algal bloom. And also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Amanda Foss was the one who worked on this down at Greenwater Labs. They do a ton of work on harmful algal blooms, but she actually was the one who designed the protocol to process our glass fiber filters and determine whether there were actually toxins on them or not. So she was a huge part of it as well. So a little bit of background. In 2019, I joined the Land Council as a resource ecologist and basically carried on a pond water quality monitoring program that had been going on for over 10 years at that point. The town of Nantucket, Nantucket itself is an island south of Cape Cod, and the town of Nantucket covers the Great Ponds, so the larger ponds that are technically government managed, and then the Land Council as a nonprofit steps in and does monitoring and water quality research on the smaller ponds where there are issues or research of interest across the island. So I moved to Nantucket in spring 2019, and the main pond we're going to talk about today is Capon Pond, but we have researched several other small ponds. Gibbs Pond is another one that often has harmful algal blooms, and we have set these aerosol samplers up at. Hummock Pond's another one. There's a few, but the main one we're focusing on today is Capon Pond. So, water quality surveys. This little table goes back to 2009 and goes through 2019, and it covers Capon and Gibbs, Hummock, and Head of Hummock, which I had already mentioned. There's a few others we had looked into, Emily had looked into before I started. When she was resource ecologist, Little Wee Weeder, Long Pond, which is actually tidally influenced on the island, Maxie Pond, My Comet Pond, Pest House, Tom Nevers, and Washing. At one time or another, all of these ponds have had recorded harmful algal blooms, some of them more than others. And we tend to focus our efforts on the ones that are having major issues. So that for the last 2-3 years, 2-3 seasons now, has been Capon Pond and Gibbs Pond especially. So harmful algal blooms. As far as observed harmful algal blooms, if you go on Google satellite images and look at Capon Pond on Nantucket, it is very green. Much more green than the ponds nearby, which would be Washing Pond and Maxie Pond. Capon tends to have water quality trouble for extended periods throughout the summertime, which is one of the reasons we were so interested, and Mike and Vince were so interested in trying to set up an aerosol sampler, is that Capon Pond for the last couple of years had been having sustained harmful algal blooms that were producing toxins, mostly microcystin, and these blooms were lasting anywhere from a week to the one in 2019 where we did manage to capture the information in this, the data in this note. That was a bloom that lasted over a month continuously and was producing toxins almost the entire time.
RJ, sorry, we're not seeing your slides advance.
Oh, what slide are you on?
We see the note in L and RM, volume
Okay,
37.
hold on a second, and let me see if I can get you guys to come along. Okay. Am I flipping through now?
Yes, it's good.
Okay, cool. So you guys were stuck on this one. So this is just the Lake and Reservoir Management Note 113. This is already talked about. This is a table I was just talking about. Years of water quality surveys for the Land Council. So Land Council tends to be opportunistic, and we aren't just rigidly monitoring the same ponds every year. We tend to look for gaps in data on the island on these small ponds. And as I said, the town covers the larger great ponds on the island with pretty rigid water quality monitoring programs. They have established TMDLs already. So these ponds we're looking at are smaller, sort of out of the way ponds, are often on conservation land or private property. The next table, observed harmful algal blooms. So this is going back to 2009. Hedahummock Pond is one that the Land Council's done a lot of work on and has had a lot of harmful algal blooms. But as I was saying, Capon Pond, one that hadn't been looked at as much, but it was one that you could see you could see from the satellite images that there were blooms occurring. And so this is one that we really, really wanted to look at. And it was one that we've been focusing on for the last few years here. So going on to the next slide. So Hedahummock Pond, which I had mentioned, had multiple blooms. Cyanobacterial toxin producing blooms. This is a SecuDisc image from there from July 26th of 2011, and Hedahummock Pond, August 31st. Conditions change pretty frequently. These blooms, as many of you already know, are very ephemeral. They change almost by the hour. Well, wind shifts and these blooms can move around. So we focused on Capon Pond because it was one that was having sustained continuous blooms. All right. See if I can go to the next slide here. Oops. Okay. So risks from cyanobacteria blooms. They form those dense, floating, classic spilled paint looking mats, disrupts the ecosystems, can kill off fish and cause oxygen depletion, which is something we've seen on some of the ponds out on Nantucket. And these toxins obviously are a public safety risk and of major concern. With Capom, it's really interesting. The pond is surrounded by heavy Phragmites growth and isn't regularly accessed from the public, which is a good thing, especially as we try to monitor and figure out the water quality issues on this pond. This is another image from Hedahummock Pond of a pretty nasty bloom. So these are the primary cyanotoxin groups. The three major groups are the dermatotoxins, which affect skin, the hepatotoxins, which are going to affect your liver, and then the neurotoxins, which are going to impact your nervous system. They have a number of different health implications for both wildlife and us humans, domesticated animals. Knock on wood, Nantucket has not had any recorded incidents officially of a harmful algal bloom causing sickness or illness in a person, but our neighboring island, Martha's Vineyard, has had some issues. They have had a man go crabbing last year, and he had cuts on his feet, and he went into a pond that did have toxins being produced, and he started having muscle spasms, difficulty breathing. He had to be taken to the hospital. So this is a very real issue that we're trying to stay on top of. So the water quality monitoring, this data that we collect, we really try to be as consistent and thorough as possible, even though we aren't regularly collecting from all these ponds year in and year out. We collected this water quality data on Capon Gibbs at 2-week intervals. So every other week we would go sample on Tuesday at each of these ponds. And every week we would at least go and give a visual on these ponds to make sure that they weren't having a harmful algal bloom. And if they were, we would notify the town, post it on the town's website, and do our best to post signs and notify the public that there was a harmful algal bloom happening. And just visually, every week it was just taking photos, seeing if there was any green scum or cyanobacteria present in the water column. And then when we were actually sampling, we would use Eurofins Abraxas strip testing kits, which for those of you who haven't used them, it's very much like a pool test strip kit where you collect a small sample, you have to freeze and thaw it 3 times to lyse the cells open, and then carry out the procedure to do the strip test and see if any toxins are being produced. It's a very, it can be a useful tool. If the toxins are being produced at a low level, it can be tough to discern whether you're getting that test result or if you're getting some interference. So Gibbs Pond has a lot of tannins in it, and it can interfere with those test strip results. So those are things that if we get a hit on the Abraxas test, we end up shipping these samples off island to Greenwater Labs. And if there is a significant event where we did get a hit, we try to also deploy these aerosol samplers, which tend to need more than just the hat. We try to deploy them when there's also significant weather events coming through. So Nantucket tends to have a lot of wind being out on the ocean, and that's one of the factors we try to incorporate. We try to get a good stirring the drink, so to speak, on these ponds. So here's the Eurofin Abraxas test. These strips on the right there is Capon Pond. On the left side of that strip is, it says Abraxas. That's sort of the handle of the strip. And then there's a faded dim purple line just to the left of that Abraxas label, or just to the right, sorry. That's the test line, so, or the control line that has to appear. If the control line doesn't appear, it's an invalid test. And as I said, with Gibbs Pond, with tannins in the water, sometimes that happens. But Capon Pond, luckily, we don't have a ton of tannins in the water. So Capon, on this particular sample for September 9th, 2019, there was no test line present. We had the control line, so we knew it was a valid strip test, and there was a pretty non-existent, or if you were in person, you might just be able to see purple pigmentation where the test line is. And that interpretation is approaching 2 to 2.5 parts per billion of anatoxin A. We have 2 types of strip tests on hand. We have microcystin and anatoxin A. Those are the 2 most common toxins that we've run into on Nantucket. And more often than not, it's microcystin. But in 2019, we were getting a lot of anatoxin from Capon Pond. So that's a strip test that would trigger the Land Council to ship a sample off island. All right, next slide. So Capon Pond, here's a satellite image of Nantucket, and Capon Pond is the one that has that little pin in it on the left, right near the northern end of the island. Now you can see Nantucket Harbor is that large embayment to the east. That was not always the harbor. Capon Pond actually used to be the harbor. It's this little mitten-shaped pond that used to be connected to Nantucket Sound. So there's a lot of human activity, and now there's a lot of homes around and set behind the Phragmites on Capon Pond. The other pond I've been referring to is Gibbs Pond, and that one is in, we call it the Middle Moors on the island, and that is a very large area of conservation land adjacent to a cranberry bog towards the eastern end of the island. So a little more of a close-up image of Capon and Gibbs. So that image of Capon, you can see it has a green sort of tinge to it, and to the east or right on the image, the Google Earth image, is actually Washing Pond. So that pond clearly is not having a harmful algal bloom, and Capon is. There's a little bit of glare on Gibbs in this satellite image, but Gibbs is a pretty classic round kettle hole pond, deepest in the middle. And as I said, it's surrounded by conservation land and abutted on one side by a cranberry bog. Now, Capon Pond's bathymetry is a little different. It's very shallow. It's influenced by Nantucket Sound and the weather coming off of there. It's max about 7 feet deep and pretty shallow basin. So cyanotoxin samples from Capon Pond in 2019. So these were the concentrations. It, as I said, was a pretty continuous harmful algal bloom here on Capon Pond in 2019. It really got going in August, and when Capon Pond does have issues with blooms, it does tend to get going in August. When the water is the warmest, and since it's so shallow and has a pretty mucky bottom, it tends to carry that warm momentum through into September, and it was producing these toxins, both antitoxin A and microcystin, through October. So we also, on top of doing the toxin analysis, the Land Council also ships samples off island to be analyzed for exactly what the algal community is and the concentrations of those. And there was a pretty dense population in 2019 as far as the algal community goes. There was a lot of Ephinizamenon. That really dominated and had dominated on and off for these last couple of years. But as you can see, Capon Pond has a pretty diverse cyanobacteria community throughout the season here. And 2020 and 2021, we've been trying different management techniques with the managers of the pond, the Conservation Foundation, but these species are still present and sort of go through boom and bust cycles in Capon. Okay. So 2019, the investigation, no previous studies had documented the capture of antitoxin A. We weren't expecting to see antitoxin A in the concentrations. We had seen it the year prior. Capon wasn't producing that kind of antitoxin A. It had produced microcystin in the past, and other locations on the island we had seen antitoxin A. So we were testing for the strip tests, and when it did start to appear, we were pretty excited to be able to deploy the aerosol samplers. We hypothesized that ATX could become airborne under certain environmental conditions. So as I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about a bloom and when to set up the aerosol sampler, we're looking for some serious weather. We're looking for a thunderstorm to blow through or a nor'easter or something like that to get the surface water moving, to get wave action going, and to get some more interface than usual with the atmosphere. So as I said, we were working with the Land Council, myself, Emily Molden, Jim Sutherland, IBM with Vince Moriarty and Mike Kelly, who helped design this aerosol sampler, and then Greenwater Laboratories, who we sent the filters from the aerosol samplers to down in Florida to analyze for these toxins. So there's a picture of the aerosol device. it sounds really sci-fi and fascinating, but all that is a waterproof plastic ammo can with a battery, a clock, a regulator for how much volume of air is being pumped by an electric air pump inside that box. And then there's a hose going out to a tripod, which has that's actually a funnel you would use to pour oil into your car, and that hose goes into the back of the funnel, and there is a plastic cassette with a 47 millimeter glass fiber filter on it. Now, we had it set to pump about 6 liters per minute air over that filter. These batteries that are in it have a varied runtime depending on conditions and how much you work them. We could get reliably up to 12 hours out of this unit pumping air at that rate, 6 liters per minute. It could run longer, but Kapam's location, we didn't want it to stop and have that filter sitting there for any length of time. We know that antitoxin A, microcystin, and these cyanobacterial toxins do tend to break down when exposed to UV light. So we really like to have the thing still running and be able to come shut it down. But if the battery were to die, if there was a malfunction, there's also a clock inside there in that box, which is wired in, and it will let us know when it stopped, which was very helpful. So we deployed these at Kapam. We initially tested them at Gibbs Pond, and then those filters were sent to Green Water Lab for analysis. And as I said, they developed a protocol for taking filter blanks, comparing them to the filters we sent them, and determining whether toxins were captured. So there's the aerosol sampler set up at Gibbs Pond. And the shores of Gibbs Pond is a little bit clearer Phragmites, and then that on the right is a close-up of that funnel on the tripod with that cassette and glass fiber filter in there. So here's the interior of the box, as I was just describing. The battery, there's a little regulator, the pump, and on the picture on the right, you can get a better look at that little regulator for volume. It's on the bottom there, that bottom red arrow. So that is pointing at the little knob with a metal ball to determine how much air volume is going over. And as I said, we try to keep it at 6 liters per minute. So that's the guts of the aerosol sampling device. Now, on September 11th, 2019, we set up a sampling event on the north shore of Kapam Pond, and this is where we captured the antitoxin A. There was a lot of antitoxin A being produced at the time in the water column, and this note got a lot of press, and when I speak to people, I try to remind them that this was a trace amount we captured on these filters. This was not the amount that was found in the water column. This was not an amount that would make you sick if you were standing next to the pond. This is something that was captured, but it wasn't a human health risk at the time. Now, there's a lot of discussion about whether human health issues would arise if you were there for years and years under these conditions, but just like to reiterate that this wasn't something where Kapam Pond would have been dangerous to the public if you're standing there just breathing. But so we ran those for 15 hours, just over 15 hours. The conditions were perfect. We had a harmful algal bloom occurring, and we had a thunderstorm rolling through. There was fog. There was winds with gusts up to 20 to 30 miles an hour. So these were very, very good conditions for a storm, and to see if we could capture anything escaping the water column during this wave action. So this is the photograph I took the morning with the sampler deployed. I had to wade in there with my waders and gloves on and actually anchor. If you look closely, there's a little bit of paracord and one of those spiral dog anchors I stuck into the bottom to make sure that this didn't blow over as the storm was coming through. And then the box is tucked into the Phragmites behind it and sort of safely out of the way. We put a lock on it just so that no one vandalizes or messes with any of the equipment in there. We hypothesized that these increased wind speeds and increased wave action produced these little droplets, and that the fog might have shielded anything that got to the filters from UV degradation so that we could get to the filter in time before it was broken down. So these are have conditions on Capon Pond. It gets pretty nasty there. That's a Secchi disc at 6-inch depth, and that is some scum right by where I deployed the sampler in 2019. That's very heavy, very thick, and typically produces toxins. And then that caution sign is actually one of the ones we deploy if there is a bloom detected when we're trying to notify the public and keep them away from the pond. All right, and with that, I think I'm at 9:45, and thank you all. And we can do.
Yeah, thank you, RJ. Great. I'm looking at the questions and I don't see any questions at this time for you. We can
Okay.
give it a minute to see if any come in.
Absolutely.
Okay, so there is one. It's asked, is there a treatment?
For blooms, yes. So Capon Pond, we've actually been working with the Conservation Foundation. In 2020, they started working with this group to treat the pond with um, first an alum treatment initially, and then algicide if necessary. So that plan went through the Conservation Commission in 2020, and in the spring of 2021, the Conservation Foundation did a very conservative small dose of alum on Capon Pond, and we monitored closely. As I said, we were checking every week to see if there was a bloom on Capon. There was one in August when Capon typically has started to have trouble, and they spot treated with algicide. The algal community was still very concentrated in 2021, but there weren't as many blooms. We're not sure if that's anecdotal or if the alum treatment actually did what it was supposed to. We're going to be exploring that this year as well.
Great, thank you. And then the next question and the last one that we'll do for you is how long does it take for UV to degrade cyanotoxins to non-detectable concentrations?
So if the cyanotoxins are out of the water and they're on a surface, on a rock or on sand or on a leaf of a plant like Phragmites, it could take as little as an hour. It really varies. So when you get overcast days, it can extend the life of it. It can survive overnight. And there have actually been studies, and some of the talks I've attended here at NEPOMS have discussed if it gets into the sediment, into the sand, and is protected from the UV light, it can last down there for weeks or even months. But UV light tends to break it down very quickly.
Great, thank you so much, RJ.